Okay, so imagine for a second that you're Barack Obama's very first full-time campaign volunteer.
Right, specifically in New York City.
Yeah, exactly, in NYC.
Okay.
And you're this lifelong, super vocal, anti-war activist. Like, you genuinely believe that war is, in your own words, expensive, stupid, and almost always avoidable.
You're someone who doesn't romanticize conflict at all. You don't cheer for body counts.
Right. You hate the whole concept.
Hmm.
But then you wake up today and you write this incredibly passionate, totally uncompromising essay.
Demanding the violent collapse of a sovereign government.
Yes, exactly. Demanding regime change. It's just this massive, jarring paradox that we're staring at today.
Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
It's a phenomenal contradiction, honestly. We are looking at a rhetorical landscape that just intentionally shatters all those neat little boxes we usually put political ideologies into.
So, to give you the lay of the land, our source material for this deep dive is a blog post. It's dated April 9th, 2026, and it's by a writer named Paramendra Kumar Bhagat. And the title alone is just, it's designed to grab you by the collar. It's called Barackface. Why I, an anti-war advocate, demand regime change in Iran.
Yeah, Barackface. It's quite a title. So our mission today is to completely deconstruct this argument, right? We're going to look at the mechanics of his logic, examine this highly specific playbook he lays out for a revolution,
and eventually look at the mind of the author himself, because his incredibly eclectic background completely changes how you read the text.
Oh, totally. We'll get into his whole futurist AI background later, which is wild. But before we get into the architecture of his argument, we need to lay down a really crucial ground rule for you, the listener.
Absolutely. We have to do this because we are diving into incredibly polarizing territory here.
Yeah, we're talking about regime change, the Middle East, proxy militias, the internal politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So we want to make our position completely clear.
Right. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing Paramendra Kumar Bhagat's viewpoints, and we're not condemning them either.
Exactly. Our role here is strictly analytical. We are impartial guides.
We're just trying to help you understand how the author constructs his perspective, the mechanisms he uses to justify his claims. We are mapping out his constructed reality, not telling you what to believe about it.
Okay, with that out of the way, let's unpack this. The very foundation of his constructed reality begins with, a preemptive strike against his own political camp.
Yeah, right out of the gate.
Under that heading, Barackface,
Yeah.
he just drops his Obama volunteer credential and absolutely insists on his anti-war purity. He says he doesn't believe any flag or ideology is worth the mutilation of another human being.
Visceral language.
Mutilation.
Right. But then, in the exact same breath, he declares, quote, "The regime in Iran must fall." It feels so contradictory. It's like a doctor prescribing a highly dangerous invasive surgery, not because they like cutting people open, but because they believe the alternative is a terminal disease.
That is a great analogy.
How does he actually bridge that gap without sounding completely hypocritical to his own side? What's fascinating here is that he bridges it by completely co-opting the language of the traditional anti-war movement. He turns it back on itself.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, he doesn't soften his stance, right? He doubles down. Like you said, he uses words like mutilation to establish his progressive bona fides. He's sending a deliberate signal to the reader. He's saying, I am not a neoconservative hawk. I'm not looking for an excuse to invade.
Right, because he knows that the moment he says regime change, a huge demographic will just immediately stop listening.
Exactly. By leading with his Obama credentials, he forces that specific progressive audience to stay in the room. He's saying, look, I'm one of you, now hear me out.
But he goes further than just, establishing credibility. He actually tries to redefine what regime change means in this specific context.
He really does. In traditional discourse, demanding the fall of a government is viewed as the ultimate escalation. It's the height of aggression.
Yeah, usually.
Yeah.
But he completely flips that. He frames the survival of the current regime as the actual trigger for a catastrophic war.
Right. He argues that if this government stays in power, we aren't going to be debating a theoretical war in the distant future. He says we will be living through a bloodbath in just a few short years.
So he's asking the reader to follow this really specific, almost ruthless logic. He's saying that demanding the collapse of this state is actually an act of ultimate conflict prevention.
It's an enormous extrapolation. He is challenging the fundamental assumption that maintaining the status quo equals peace.
Yeah. In his framework, passive containment isn't diplomacy. It's delayed warmongering.
Which brings us to the ticking clock. Because if he believes a massive explosion is inevitable, We have to look at the mechanics of why he thinks time is running out.
Right. Why is the clock ticking so fast? He points directly to the regime's ecosystem in the Middle East, specifically its proxy network.
And he argues that exporting revolution isn't just, like, a side hobby for Tehran, it's the core of their identity.
He lists them out, right? Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and these various Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria.
And we really need to define what he means by proxy here, because he makes a vital distinction.
Okay, what's the distinction?
He is not describing independent actors who just happen to share religious or political affinity with Tehran. He characterizes these groups as direct functional instruments of Tehran's foreign policy.
Oh, I see. So they are wholly funded, armed, and directed by the regime to project power beyond its borders.
Exactly. They are extensions of the state apparatus itself.
But wait, hold on. A lifelong anti-war advocate should theoretically look at that volatile network and say, okay, we need aggressive diplomacy. What about treaties? What about getting the international community around a table?
You would think so. But the author explicitly brings up the 2015 nuclear deal.
The JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Just for context for the listener, that was a massive landmark agreement where the international community offered huge economic sanctions relief in exchange for Iran severely limiting its uranium enrichment programs.
Right. And it was heralded as this incredible triumph of diplomacy at the time, but forgot. He completely dismisses it.
Really? An anti-war guy dismisses a peace treaty?
Yep. He says, and this is a direct quote, "It bought time, it did not buy peace."
Huh. Because he views that diplomatic approach as fundamentally flawed in its diagnosis of the regime.
Right.
Like treating a symptom but not the disease.
Exactly. To understand why he dismisses it, look at the escalations he cites from 2024 and 2025 between Iran and Israel. He uses those events to argue that the regime views any de-escalation, any diplomatic compromise, purely as weakness.
Just a weakness to be exploited.
Right. To him, the 2015 deal was just a financial band-aid. Sure, it might have temporarily frozen the nuclear centrifuges, but he argues it did absolutely nothing to dismantle the conventional proxy network.
And I suppose those proxies just use the influx of cash from the sanctions relief to expand their operations.
That's exactly his point.
So it's like he views the regime not as a traditional government with typical state interests, but like a shark.
Right.
A shark has to keep swimming forward to force water over its gills, or it literally dies.
That is a perfect way to look at his argument.
He's saying that this regime has to perpetually manufacture these external proxy wars just to justify its internal existence.
Yes. The moment it stops moving, the moment it stops fighting external enemies, it suffocates under the weight of its own domestic failures.
So diplomacy, to him, is just asking the shark to hold its breath. It's fundamentally not a permanent solution.
That shark metaphor perfectly encapsulates his concept of their self-reinforcing cycle. It is brutally simple logic. According to his analysis, the regime intentionally uses these proxies, firing rockets, disrupting global shipping lanes, launching drones specifically to provoke a retaliation.
They want retaliation from neighboring states or the international community. That sounds insane on the surface. Why would a government actively court being attacked?
Because the retaliation is the point.
Wait, really? The retaliation is the goal?
Yes. Once a foreign power strikes back, or even just threatens to strike back, the regime can immediately declare a national security crisis. They point to the sky and say, look, the imperialists are at the gates.
And under the banner of a national emergency, they suddenly have the perfect, unassailable excuse to utterly crush any domestic resistance.
Exactly. We are at war. You can't protest right now. The author explicitly writes that these proxy wars in Yemen, Lebanon, and Gaza are not sideshows. They are the main event.
Wow. So they are the vital engine that keeps the country on a perpetual war footing, which keeps the regime in power. Export revolution, provoke a response, use a response to lock down your own citizens, rinse and repeat.
And this cycle leads to his most terrifying prediction for the reader. He states that containment is an absolute illusion.
Because eventually these isolated brush fires, these proxy conflicts are going to merge. They're going to combine into a single massive direct confrontation.
And he warns that the resulting body count won't be measured in dozens. He says it'll be in the tens of thousands.
Which sets up the next massive pivot in his argument. Usually when a geopolitical analyst paints a picture, this dire like a ticking clock, a regional network of heavily armed militias, the looming threat of nuclear weapons, the very next sentence is a demand for the American military to intervene.
Right. You expect calls for airstrikes, maybe a naval blockade, or a full-on coalition invasion force.
Exactly. But this is where the author takes a sharp, super unexpected left turn. He completely and utterly rejects the savior complex.
He states in no uncertain terms, quote, "This is not a call for invasion."
He outright bans the use of American bombs or Israeli jets. He brings up the ghosts of interventions past, pointing directly to Iraq in 2003 and Libya in 2011 as his primary evidence.
And we need to unpack the mechanics of why he thinks those interventions failed so spectacularly, because it's absolutely central to his strategy. He uses the word quagmires.
Yeah, he's arguing that political legitimacy is an organic material. It fundamentally cannot be imported.
Right. Let's look at Iraq as the prime example here. In 2003, a foreign military came in, completely dismantled the existing power structure in a matter of weeks, and tried to install a new government from the top down.
And what happened? By destroying the entire state apparatus without an organic, locally accepted replacement ready to step in, they created this massive power vacuum.
And that vacuum didn't lead to a flourishing Jeffersonian democracy. It led to brutal sectarian violence, insurgency, and civil war.
So the author is applying that exact historical data to Iran. He argues that if a new government is installed by a foreign tank or a drone strike, it will inherently lack the mandate of the people.
Exactly. It will forever be viewed as a puppet of an imperial power, which just guarantees endless instability.
So the cure of a foreign invasion is actually vastly worse than the disease. It permanently destroys the immune system of the nation.
This is the crux of his true anti-war stance. He wants the regime completely gone, yes, but he deeply, deeply distrusts the traditional blunt force tools of empire to get the job done.
He's demanding a radical paradigm shift from a military operation conducted by outsiders to a purely organic revolution owned and operated by the citizens. Iranian-owned, Iranian-led. That's his absolute boundary.
That is the boundary, yeah.
But okay, let's play devil's advocate here. Let's look at that practically. A purely Iranian-led revolution sounds beautifully noble on paper.
It does.
But we are talking about unarmed civilians going up against a deeply entrenched, heavily armed state apparatus. An apparatus that controls the military, the police, the intelligence services, the economy.
All of it.
It sounds like asking someone to escape a locked, heavily guarded fortress from the inside, but you're explicitly forbidding anyone on the outside from throwing them a rope or breaking down the door. I mean, is he just being terribly naive?
Well, he anticipates that exact skepticism. To prove he isn't being naive, he doesn't just offer hope. He offers a historical timeline. In Section 4 of his argument, he lays out the domestic tinderbox.
Oh, right. The history of the uprisings.
Yes. He builds this compelling, data-driven case that the internal populace is not passive, and they certainly aren't waiting for a savior. They have been actively, physically testing the regime's weaknesses for over a decade.
He traces this lineage of resistance, doesn't he? Starting with the 2009 Green Movement.
And moving through the massive 2019 fuel protests.
Right. And culminating in the 2022 to 2023 Woman, Life, Freedom uprisings. The specific acts of defiance he details in the text are incredibly visceral.
They really are. He uses these data points to convince the reader that the populace has already crossed the Rubicon.
He describes young women standing in the streets, taking off their compulsory hijabs and just throwing them into fires. He highlights industrial workers walking off job sites, which effectively paralyzes the state's economy.
And perhaps most staggeringly, he mentions school children chanting against the supreme leader.
Yeah, think about the mechanics of that kind of bravery. To chant against the absolute theological authority of a state when the known guaranteed consequence is a bullet or the hangman's noose.
It's unfathomable.
It illustrates a populace that, as he writes, is, quote, done waiting.
And how the regime responds to that bravery is the linchpin of his analysis here. The author points out that the state didn't respond with political concessions. They responded with live ammunition.
Live ammo, mass executions, and sweeping indiscriminate arrests. Now, most outside observers would look at a government executing dissidents and think, wow, they are terrifyingly strong. They have absolute control.
But Pagat argues the exact opposite. He claims that this level of brutality is actually the ultimate proof of terminal weakness.
How does that work?
Well, his logic is that a secure, legitimate government that actually has the consent of its governed, they don't need to execute their own high school students to maintain order in the streets.
Right. That makes sense.
By relying entirely on lethal, overwhelming force against unarmed citizens, the regime proves that its internal moral legitimacy has completely evaporated. The social contract is dead.
So he's saying that they are no longer a government. They are an occupying force in their own country. They survive entirely on fear, not consent.
Exactly. But, as you pointed out earlier, this brings us to a really heartbreaking bottleneck in his logic.
The people are extraordinarily brave, and the regime is ideologically bankrupt. But historically, every single one of those uprisings he listed, 2009, 2019, 2022, has been successfully and violently suppressed.
Because the regime has the guns.
And the protesters do not. So if the internal populace is fatally outgunned and foreign militaries are strictly banned from intervening, we are missing a massive puzzle piece here. How does this author actually expect the fortress to fall?
This is where the text pivots from historical analysis into a highly specific tactical playbook. He shifts his focus away from the streets of Tehran and turns his attention to the global stage.
Oh, the diaspora.
Yes. He addresses the Iranian diaspora directly. He identifies them as the fulcrum of this entire strategic operation.
He points out that the diaspora numbers in the millions. And crucially, they live in free societies. They have financial resources, they have access to Western universities, they hold foreign passports.
And they operate outside the physical reach of the regime's riot police.
But I want to really dig into the mechanics of what he's asking them to do, because he's not just asking for, like, thoughts and prayers or a supportive hashtag on social media.
No, not at all. He gives them a rigorous checklist of actionable asymmetrical warfare tactics. If we connect this to the bigger picture, he essentially deputizes the diaspora.
Okay, let's look at the checklist. First, he tackles the information war.
Right. When uprisings happen, the regime's immediate tactic is to impose a localized or national internet blackout, geo-blocking.
Right, they cut the fiber optic cables so the world can't see the violence, and so the protesters can't coordinate with each other.
The author tells the diaspora it is their job to shatter that blackout. They are tasked with funding and utilizing satellite internet, VPNs, and independent media networks that the regime cannot touch.
They have to amplify every single video, every single voice coming out of the country, ensuring the regime cannot commit atrocities in the dark.
And then he moves into political and financial warfare. He demands heavy government lobbying in their host countries.
Meaning, he wants the diaspora to pressure Western capitals to systematically dismantle the regime's wealth. He specifically targets the Revolutionary Guards, right?
Yes, the primary military apparatus keeping the regime in power. He wants their international assets frozen. He wants their global money laundering networks exposed.
And he even mentions travel visas, right? Permanently denying visas to regime officials and their families.
Exactly. He wants to ensure that the people ordering executions in Tehran can't send their kids to luxury boarding schools in London or buy penthouses in Vancouver.
Wow. So it is a strategy of total economic and social isolation, driven not by foreign governments, but by the diaspora lobbying those governments.
But there is a deeper psychological warfare element here that the author emphasizes.
Let me interject on that, actually, because this is where the logistics get kind of murky for me. He explicitly tells the diaspora to take to the streets globally, organizing massive marches from Los Angeles to Toronto to Berlin to Sydney.
Right.
But practically speaking, how does a peaceful protest march in downtown Toronto actually protect a university student facing down tear gas in Isfahan? Like, a cardboard sign in Canada doesn't stop a bullet in Iran.
Physically, no, it doesn't. But psychologically, it is vital. Totalitarian regimes survive by isolating the individual.
What do you mean?
They want the dissident sitting in their living room in Tehran to believe that they are entirely alone, that the resistance is futile, and that the whole world has just moved on and doesn't care. The author writes, the diaspora's job is to make sure every Iranian inside the country knows they are not alone. When a massive, globally coordinated protest happens in 20 different major cities simultaneously, and that footage is beamed back into Iran via those independent media networks we just talked about, it shatters the regime's illusion of isolation.
It provides immense psychological armor to the people risking their lives on the ground. That makes a lot of sense. Furthermore, the author is deeply aware of how the regime will try to counter this.
Oh, absolutely. He specifically warns the diaspora, do not let the regime's propaganda machine paint you as foreign agents or monarchists.
Yeah, that is a critical defensive tactic.
Okay.
Because the regime's state media will instantly try to delegitimize the diaspora.
They will tell the internal populace those people in Toronto are being paid by the CIA, or they just want to bring back the oppressive monarchy of the Shah.
So the author urges the diaspora to aggressively control their own narrative. Their message must be unified and pristine. We are not asking for a return to the past. We are simply asking for your right to choose your own future.
So we can see the exact formula the author has built here. The internal populace provides the physical vanguard, the localized anger, and the strikes. The external diaspora acts as the shield, the megaphone, and the financier.
They weaponize the freedoms and the legal systems of the West against the regime. It's an incredibly intricate machine. But let's play this out. Let's say the machine works. The internal pressure and external isolation reach a tipping point, and the regime's power structure fundamentally fractures. The supreme leader is gone. What happens the day after?
That is the big question.
Because we just spent 10 minutes talking about how regime change usually results in catastrophic power vacuums and civil war. Does the author genuinely believe an organic revolution guarantees a democratic utopia?
Not at all. And this is where his pragmatism really anchors the text. He explicitly admits that a post-regime Iran would, in his words, not magically become Switzerland overnight.
Okay, so he's realistic.
Very. He openly acknowledges that all political transitions are inherently dangerous, messy, and fraught with instability.
But he argues that the underlying mathematical equations of the country would fundamentally change. He claims that a government forced to actually answer to its own citizens, rather than what he terms a messianic ideology, would immediately have to shift its priorities just to survive.
And to illustrate this, he lists the terrifying domestic crises that any new government would immediately inherit. We're talking about collapsing infrastructure, heavily polluted and poisoned rivers,
A devastated economy and a massive brain drain as all the brightest youth flee the country.
Exactly. If we look at the mechanics of statecraft, his logic is pretty sound. A democratic Iran facing catastrophic environmental collapse and economic ruin at home structurally cannot continue funding Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen.
The voters simply wouldn't allow it.
Right. When your own rivers are dry and your citizens can't buy bread, you cannot spend billions of dollars projecting power across the Middle East. The author argues that a legitimate, accountable government has every structural incentive to stop exporting war and start fixing its own plumbing.
And this cascades into his broader vision for the entire Middle East. He suggests that without a theocratic regime in Tehran that requires perpetual enemies to justify its domestic iron fist, the prospect of actual lasting peace between Iran and its neighbors suddenly becomes a mathematical possibility rather than a pipe dream.
Neighbors like Saudi Arabia, Israel, the Gulf states, he addresses the inherent fear of the unknown that keeps the international community clinging to the status quo.
He knows policymakers will say, "Better the devil we know."
But he rejects that entirely. He argues that the devil we know is actively enriching uranium, funding global terrorism, and executing its own children.
The status quo is instability. It's a slow-motion train wreck.
Yes. So yes, the unknown future of a post-regime transition is guaranteed to be messy, but it holds the only actual chance for long-term peace. He frames it as a binary choice. A guaranteed catastrophic regional explosion in the near future versus a difficult, risky, but potentially peaceful transition right now.
Which brings us full circle to his opening paradox. This is how he justifies his stance. Demanding this highly orchestrated, diaspora-backed organic transition is, in his constructed reality, the only mathematically and morally consistent anti-war position left on the board.
It's a remarkably tight geopolitical argument.
It is incredibly tight. It's passionate, highly structured, and relies on this fascinating synergy between grassroots street protests and global networking. But to truly grasp the depth of this essay, we have to look beyond the text itself and examine the mind that produced it.
Oh, yes. This is where it gets really fun.
This is where the source material gets wildly interesting. Because we spent some time looking at the metadata, the sidebar of the blog, the archives. We need to talk about the absolute enigma that is Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
The digital footprint attached to this single blog post is just staggering. When you click around the site, you realize you are not just reading a one-off political op-ed from a Washington think tank.
No, not at all. This blog has an archive stretching all the way back to 2004. He's amassed over 4.8 million page views.
And the sheer volume and variety of his writing is almost dizzying.
Let me just give you, the listener, a taste of the book titles featured right next to this geopolitical essay.
Okay.
He's written novels like Around the World in 1,000 Days and The Country of Geniuses, A Race Through AI Adolescence.
Novels, but also dense business and technology books.
Yeah, like Marketing Escape Velocity and Liquid Computing, The Future of Human-Tech Symbiosis. He writes extensively about agentic AI exploding in 2026.
And then he pivots to these deeply philosophical, almost futurist spiritual texts, like calciism, the economic and spiritual blueprint for an age of abundance.
I mean, synthesizing this incredible volume of work gives us a completely new lens to read his strategy for Iran. This author is a polymath.
He is a futurist heavily focused on the absolute cutting edge of artificial intelligence. He is someone deeply invested in calciism, which appears to be his own synthesis of spiritual philosophy and economic theory aimed at creating global abundance.
He is writing about Earth-to-Earth rocketry, quantum computing, trade wars, and AI safety, all while maintaining this massive blog for over 2 decades.
You really have to pause and imagine the sheer mental bandwidth required to hold all of these disciplines in your head at once.
Right. How does a mind that is actively theorizing about human-tech symbiosis and quantum computing approach a gritty, bloody, analog conflict like the one in Iran? How does a tech futurist design a revolution?
That is the ultimate aha moment of this deep dive. If you look closely at his technological theories, specifically his concepts of liquid computing and agentic AI, you see a mind that is fundamentally obsessed with decentralized systems.
Let's actually define those terms for the listener because it makes the connection so much clearer. When he talks about liquid computing, we aren't talking about water.
No, not at all.
In tech terms, liquid computing refers to a system where computing resources aren't trapped in rigid individual hardware boxes. Instead, processing power and memory flow seamlessly across a network to exactly where they are needed at any given millisecond.
And agentic AI doesn't just mean a chatbot you can talk to.
Right. Agentic AI refers to artificial intelligence systems that are autonomous. They can be given a broad goal, and they will independently make decisions, navigate obstacles, and execute tasks without needing a human to micromanage every single step.
Precisely. Now, take those two technological concepts, seamless flowing resources and decentralized autonomous action, and overlay them onto his geopolitical strategy for Iran.
Oh, wow.
It is a perfect one-to-one mapping. He completely rejects the old, rigid, centralized hardware of geopolitics. He doesn't believe in a massive foreign military, the ultimate centralized top-down hierarchy coming in to fix the problem.
So he views the revolution itself not as a military maneuver, but as a complex network problem.
Yes. He is applying the mechanics of cutting-edge technology to political liberation. His demand that the global diaspora use their interconnectedness, their media platforms, and their wealth to support the internal uprising is essentially liquid computing applied to human capital.
He wants resources, money, information, political pressure to flow seamlessly across borders to exactly where the protesters need them.
And the protesters themselves, operating without a single centralized leader that the regime can easily assassinate, act like agentic AI.
They are millions of autonomous agents, sharing a single broad goal: the fall of the regime, independently executing tactics, adapting to riot police, and navigating obstacles on the ground.
That is absolutely profound. He believes that millions of distributed, highly networked individuals, coordinating seamlessly from Los Angeles to Sydney to the streets of Tehran, can outmaneuver, exhaust, and ultimately topple a rigid, centralized, analog dictatorship.
His supreme faith in decentralized technology is the exact same faith he places in the Iranian diaspora and the human spirit. It's a crowdsourced model of revolution.
It completely reframes the entire essay. It elevates it from a standard political demand into a deeply futuristic vision of how human beings can organize to dismantle tyranny in the 21st century.
What an incredible journey we've been on with this source material. We started by exploring this jarring paradox: an Obama volunteering anti-war advocate demanding the total collapse of a sovereign regime.
We unpacked his argument that the regime is a self-reinforcing engine of proxy war and internal oppression, essentially functioning like a shark that must keep killing to breathe.
We analyzed his strict rejection of the savior complex, learning from the power vacuums of Iraq and Libya that legitimacy cannot be imported. We honored the visceral, tragic bravery of the internal uprisings.
And we mapped out his intricate, highly actionable playbook for the diaspora to act as the financial and psychological shield for the revolution.
And finally, we discovered that this deeply human plea for freedom was architected by a prolific tech futurist who views political liberation through the lens of decentralized, autonomous networks.
It is a remarkably dense, challenging piece of writing that forces the reader to reconsider the definitions of war, peace, and the actual mechanics of how massive societal change happens in the modern era.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on Bhagat's themes, but pushes the implications even further.
The author's entire strategy relies on the diaspora using their host country's infrastructure, their media, their banks, their lobbying power to fight a regime from afar. He essentially deputizes a graphic designer in Toronto or an engineer in London to actively participate in a revolution thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
In an increasingly hyper-connected digital age, an age where an author can seamlessly blend theories on agentic AI with demands for the collapse of theocracy on a single blog, what does a revolution actually look like anymore?
Right. If the physical, bleeding battleground is in the streets of Tehran, but the financial, informational, and psychological battlegrounds are being fought on server farms in Los Angeles, Berlin, and Sydney, are our traditional map-based definitions of borders, of warfare, and even of what it means to be a citizen already entirely obsolete. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the information around you, keep looking for the hidden mechanics behind the arguments, and we'll see you next time.